Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for allowing me to take some of your time and speak. Just to make sure you can hear me, always have to ask this on Zoom.
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Thank you. So I wanted to spend, let me move this out of the way. I wanted to spend a little time with you today and tell you about some of my experiences. And I'm going to start off with a story. So once upon a time, there was a company, and their digital footprint, you can see from this picture, consisted of having 3 different front-end systems, multiple back-end systems, a middle layer that went along with that. And there were over 150 developers that supported these 3 systems. What ended up happening is that because they were project-based, we would have that the engineers would end up supporting all of the systems in the front, all of the middleware systems, all of the back-end systems, and it caused a lot of problems. What also happened was that people were being moved to the work instead of being product-based, where we move the people, we move the work to the people. The result of all this is that releases were getting farther apart and the tech debt was just massively exploding. And that's when they brought me in to this small organization to say, can you please help? The very first thing I did is conduct a really large retrospective, and we used lean tools to help diagnose problems. It was extremely interesting to do this because we brought 150 people into the room and ran the retrospective. And they came up with the following kinds of root causes. There were multiples. These is just, I tried to group them as much as possible and highlighted the big ones that we decided we were going to tackle. There were different project requirements, meaning that people were actually working on the same system at one time, because you had one project going on here that touched one system, you had another project on here that touched another system, or touched that same system. So then you would have these engineers that were not communicating, and when it came time to check in the code, it was a problem. So every time they had to check in code, there was a ton of rework that had to be done. The code was inconsistent because they didn't have development standards that were being followed, peer review wasn't occurring, so it made it extremely difficult to code new work or to go back and fix work because it was just so inconsistent. Refactoring was not occurring. There was no time to refactor because everything was getting later, so people kept working on new things, new features, instead of going back and fixing the old code. All of this led to team morale being low. And one of the scariest things that was happening was that they were actually having a high rate of turnover. At the time, industry standard turnover was about 8%, and they were actually having 15 to 16% turnover, which is, you just can't really run a company and have consistent code with that. The dependencies between the services caused a lot of long compiles to happen, and building services, so moving code from one environment to another environment meant that it was really hard, which means that you couldn't move code, which means that you couldn't do testing, and everything just went back from there. And quality, of course, was going down because the bugs were just increasing as all of this. As part of the retrospective, I then turned around, and it was so interesting because I then turned around and I said, that's great, you all have figured out what all these root causes are. Now I want you to tell me how to fix the problems, because you are the knowledge workers. You know this information better than other people. You tell us how to fix this. What are the kinds of things that you would like to see done? And the solutions that the engineers came up with are very technical solutions. So they came up with, we want to break up and actually have, we want to break it up and actually have where we have one code base for every layer. We want to break up into teams and actually start doing teams where we move the work to the teams. We want to start to decouple our architecture. I said, okay, that's great, that's great. But before we start to do that, we actually have to understand, take a step back and have to understand what's our customer journey? What's our customer going to experience? What are they experiencing? And on top of that, what are all these systems? Because every time I would talk to one of them, they'd say, oh, we've got 3 backend systems. No, we've got 10 backend systems. We've got 20 APIs. No, we've got 40 APIs. So the very first thing that I did before we actually started implementing any of that is I actually said, let's do a value stream mapping session. And let's see if we can actually start to, as we start to build all this, let's create like a higher plan on how is it that we're going to do this change. But it's a very loose plan. It's not really depth. It's just we're going to tackle things as we continue on our journey. And once they understood what the value stream was and what all of the systems were, well, first off, the managers were really shocked that they actually had that many different APIs. That's the other thing they had to do, is they actually started versioning their APIs, which they weren't doing. We ended up with high level where we split based upon the value streams. We were actually able to look at how the systems were being laid out, and we broke it up into 4 different products. Notice that so far I haven't used the word agile, okay? So we broke it up into 4 different products. We created these teams that actually supported these products, and we created these teams of teams to support these products. I asked the product managers, I want you to create product visions. I want you to start creating roadmaps. I want to make sure that we keep time in there for refactoring. Started doing all of that. After 4 or 6 months, growing pains, lots of tears, having many conversations with the CTO, we went to where the code base went from 3 to 8. So we had 3 code bases. We went to 8. So we started decoupling everything. Releases went from once a year to once a month. And their goal actually was going to be that they wanted to release once a week. So they had these huge audacious goals. Ownership of code was noticed, that people started, in just the language, they started using things like our code, and we can't finish our release until things. So it was just the language started changing, and I'm starting to get goosebumps when I think of this. One team member even suggested a product updated that involved Alexa, which never before had a team member ever said, hey, can we do this? It would be really cool. The net provider score was up. We started automating our tests, so go forward kind of development. And it's just the morale, you could just tell the morale increased. Now I'm going to go back to the question of, you've noticed that I haven't said the word agile yet. And the reason why is because the CTO, who had come in like 3 or 4 years prior to this, had an issue where they had gone agile in their organization, and it had been a huge failure. So as far as he was concerned, agile was horrible and it doesn't work. But as he started seeing this and I started having conversations with him, I kept saying, okay, well, we're going to build upon this framework, and we're going to use these tools from this agile framework. We're going to use this from this agile framework. So he started slowly changing his opinion on agile and how it was going. Now, when I left them, the teams were continuing to decouple the code. Refactoring was being given a huge priority, which means that everything was going well. Their turnover rate went from 16 to 18% down to 5%, which was below the industry standard. CTO was absolutely just excited about that. And then started to create these automated tests. Now, in talking to people, when I tell the story, quite often they turn around and they tell me, oh, I've been in exactly that same situation. And I'm like, you're totally right. It's not an unusual situation to have that very first situation that was there. What is unusual is to be able to take it and actually start to build these teams of teams, and these teams, and thinking about it from a product perspective. So we're not yet using the word safe, and we're not yet using the word agile. We're coming into this and building upon some fundamental things, right? So why go agile, or even DevOps, because that's the current thing? Taking a step back and looking at the Agile Manifesto, I'm sure all of you have seen it. And when we look at the Agile Manifesto, that middle paragraph is the one that's often highlighted. But I actually think that the first one, because I'm a huge believer in continually learning, is that we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. We want to be a learning organization. We want to continue to adapt and change. And we especially want to continue to adapt and change when you're thinking about just look at what's happened in the last month, right? When people talk about an organization being agile, sometimes they think these are just processes that are in place, but it fundamentally has to be something different. It has to be an organization that is truly agile will rapidly respond to changes. And they'll rapidly respond to changes that are happening from a market perspective, from a technology perspective, competition, agile forces. So we need to be able to start emphasizing that first one. Taking a step back and thinking about that and thinking about how is it that we can build this change and start to go from creating that change that becomes a part of the culture of the organization. There are multiple change frameworks out there. The one that SAFe uses is the one by Cotter, which has 8 steps. Establish a sense of urgency. I know that a lot of people say, oh, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The other one I always hear is, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Well, okay, don't tell my mom, but I've experimented with her because she's often told me that that you can't teach an old person new tricks. And I'm like, that's not true, Mom. I find that chocolate cake works really well in getting her to change behavior. Don't tell her, please, though, because then she'll get mad at me. So, but you need to create a sense of urgency. And the way I've seen it, I saw one organization do it, is that they actually just said, if we don't change the way we do work, we are going to be out of business in 2 years. And they actually showed a graph saying, here is where we are now. Here's why we're losing customers. If we don't change this, we're going to be out of business. Just plain and simple, just being that transparent. And it seemed to work because they were able to bring in some of the change that needed to be done. We want to form a powerful guiding coalition. Now, quite often an organization will think that this means that the CTO, the CIO, the upper management, that's the powerful organization, or that's the guiding coalition. But it's really not. There are certain people within every organization that are influencers. They're not necessarily managers, but you want to tap into them. And when you tap into them, you want to bring them along with the journey, and you want to make them start to create the journey. Because as soon as they feel like they have the power to guide it, then all of a sudden they will start influencing so many other people. You want to develop a vision and strategy. And the vision is, it's not just a vision for the company, but it's also a vision for this change that you're going to be going through, this change that's going to continue to happen. You want to communicate the vision. And when you have this vision, I was reading a statistic that was talking about sending an email, because it's the first thing that people say, well, I communicated it, I sent an email. But the rate of opening of email is actually less than 10%. Just sit on that for just a little bit, especially when it comes from something like operations or something like that versus a person that they actually know. Or if they read it, it doesn't really sink in. So you communicate the vision, and then you communicate it 100 times more than you think it might need to occur. I was doing some training at a company one time, and I'm walking through the cubicles in the offices as I'm going to go talk to the person that had brought me in. And as I was going through the cubicles, I saw that the cubicles had a poster that had the vision of the company in there. It had the vision, it had this is our core values, it had the mission statement, and every cubicle in every office had it in there. So I grabbed it, folded it in half, walked in, and during SAFe training, there's a part where we talk about the vision. And I asked the question, can anybody tell me what the vision of this company is? I had 30-some people in that classroom. Not a single person could actually tell me what the vision was. And they stare at it every day, right there in their cubicle or in their office, right? Can anybody tell me what one of the core values is? That part they nailed down flat, but they couldn't tell me what the vision is. So when we talk about communicating the vision, we're talking about every time a town hall is started, it gets mentioned. Every time there's a stockholder meeting, it gets mentioned. Every time you have an opportunity to inject the vision, hey, this is where we're trying to get to, you do that. Because visions, if they're right, have a huge, it's a huge opportunity to motivate people. It can be really huge on that. We want to empower employees to, for broad-based action. This goes down to the whole concept of having that guiding coalition and giving them the opportunity to actually create the change. So it's not the managers, it's not the leaders that dictate it, it's the people that are going to be changing. They're the ones that dictate that change that should be occurring. It's the whole concept of decentralized decision making, moving the decisions down to the people that have the knowledge. But you can't just all of a sudden turn around one day and say, okay, now everybody, you're empowered to do this, and you're empowered to have broad-based action. You have to train your people to understand how to do things. You have to train your people and create some frameworks to help them. Because the last thing you want to do is give them all of this freedom, but then set them up for failure. So you need to create these guardrails to help with that. And those guardrails are really hard to do, by the way. We're not talking about stuff that's easy to do. We want to generate some short-term wins. And if you think about professional athletes and the way that professional athletes work, in their head, when they start envisioning, they always envision what it's going to be like to win. And then when they win the very first race, they have a huge celebration on it. Because when you start to think you can win, you will start to win more. If you go in with an attitude of this is never going to work, it's never going to work. You have to go in with an attitude of we're going to get to this step. We're going to win that. So you go for some low-hanging fruit usually before you start tackling the really big problems. But that doesn't mean that your vision and what you're trying to do isn't big and audacious. It's just you break it up into small incremental changes. And you celebrate each one of those small incremental changes. Once you start to do that, you consolidate those gains and you start to produce more wins, because all of that starts to build into the culture and the culture of an organization that can help to, that has this opportunity of being able to win. So what SAFE does to help lead with all of this, and I've talked quite a bit about this, is this implementation roadmap. And I actually used this implementation roadmap, going back to the very first example. I actually used this implementation roadmap when we started doing that. I just didn't tell the CTO that I was using it until we got to a certain point. We trained some lean agile change agents, and we trained them not just in SAFE. And I was like, look, we're just going to use the courseware. We're not doing SAFE just quite yet, but it's just got some really good courseware for some stuff. We trained them in some change management to help going through some of that. We of course trained the executives and the managers and all that, but you can see that the next thing that follows from there is identifying the value streams. So we identified the value streams, we created this team of teams, we created this high-level implementation, and then we did big room planning, which you heard about previously on that. So we started doing all this. By the end of the 6 months that I was able to work with this organization, the CTO was actually using the A word. He was talking about Agile and SAFE. When he left that organization to go to another organization and start to bring the change that came into that, he actually turned around and said, okay, and started using, we're going to bring Agile, we're going to start doing SAFE, as he brought in some of that change that he wanted to occur. One of the anti-patterns that I've seen, and it just happened for a Fortune 5 company that I had the great privilege of working for and kicking off their change, was when we started doing this implementation roadmap, they were all on board. We went through and we did the Leading Safe class. We trained 75 of their managers and their executives, and they said, okay, we're going to get going. We're going to get going right now. We're going to launch 10 trains all at once, and we're going to do it in 2 months. And I was like, whoa, 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 hold back. Just stop for a minute. That's actually not the way we want to do it. We actually want to take a step back. We want to launch one train. We want to learn from that and then launch the next one. But they were all excited because they had just gone through the training and because they also wanted to be the manager that said, look, I was able to bring this in and I was successful in doing this, because that's, many organizations are like that. But we were able to talk them into, hold back, let's do these things properly, like let's do a value stream mapping session, and then let's kick off the first train. And then, so we were able to do that. And when we launched the second train, the business owner, who actually, the way it was structured is the business owner actually owned a lot of this, came to me and said, you know, Michelle, I'm so glad that you actually made us wait, because we learned so much from the first one, both good things and bad things that happened. So that excitement, how do you actually harness that excitement so that you can continue to take it forward, but at the same time, doing those small incremental changes instead of this huge big bang, right? It just reminds me of, and I'm sure that some of you all have been in that same kind of situation, where I had another organization that there was a brand new CTO that came in. I heard about this, I wasn't there at the time, but a brand new CTO that came in and said, we're gonna go Agile, and said, from now on, everybody is Agile. And there was just such, and that was it, that's all that CTO did. The CTO was gone within 8 months because didn't go through that process of, why is it that we need to change? What is our change vision? What's our coalition? What do you mean by Agile? We need some training on all of this, and didn't build all of that in there. Another anti-pattern that I've seen is, especially with DevOps coming into it, because DevOps is a culture, a mindset, and a set of tools. But quite often, people come in and say, no, 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 it's a set of tools. We're going to automate everything. And in an organization, 2 or 3 organizations that I worked in, they brought in IBM, and IBM said, here's your implementation roadmap for DevOps. Here are all the tools you're going to use. So 2 years later, when I catch up with a friend of mine and I'm like, so tell me, has anything actually happened? And they're like, no, not really. And I was thinking about it and I was like, okay, so tools are responsible for about 20% of any success that can be realized. And if you concentrate only on that 20%, then you're missing out on all of that 80%, you know, about the culture, the leadership, the practices, all of that really allows an organization to be agile when market influences, viruses hit the market. So they have the tools, but they don't have the culture that allows them to adapt really well to something that's happening. So the key messages as I start to wrap up through all of this is that it is all about the people. We want to make sure that when we start talking about transformation, when we start talking about Agile, we want to not forget that it's about the people. And by that way, that includes our customer. Because quite often, especially when we start going through these transformations, we become very inward looking and we start to think about how is it that we can improve our processes? How is it that we can get better at releasing code? And we lose sight of our customer. And it is all about our customer. If we're not delivering value, we're not going to be around, right? Frameworks are necessary, especially the principles. Usually when you start a transformation, things are like going all over the place. If you can ground it back to the principles, and by the way, those principles includes things like pausing for celebration and reflection, making sure that we're actually creating new metrics for what's considered a new world outcome versus these old measures that don't really measure what we're trying to do. So our frameworks should include those kinds of things. And I think the most important one is that transformations are never actually complete. We start a transformation, it's a journey. We are never going to finish transforming. That's why I like it. Some people talk about transformations and they're starting to use the word pivot. We're going to pivot versus we're going into a transformation. We're going to pivot and we're going to start doing things different. So just in the wrap up, I would really like to thank the Pakistan Agile Education, Agile Beams, and Enterprise Agility Consulting for sponsoring this amazing self-organizing kind of thing that's happening right now that gives me goosebumps again when I think of it. And most important, thank you, the people that are actually participating and listening out there in Zoom land, for being here and participating.
Wow, that was amazing. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Michelle and Iqbal Ismailwala, for